Good morning, Dr. R. Michael Fisher here. I'm going to be talking about fear studies today. I'm going to go up to the whiteboard. I haven't used this in a long time. And let's get started with the topic that I'm on to. And I'm going to start with a couple drawings how I situate fear studies. And I think eventually through this talk, you'll get a sense of what I'm trying to do. Okay, so fear studies. This little domain up here. You've probably heard of things like Black studies, Africana studies. There's also called Latin American studies. Many of these forms of studies have been showing up. There's also, I like to call, oh, got my pen back. There's feminist studies, female studies, women's studies, right? You've heard of all these kinds of things. Another form of studies I'm interested in. And then if you've been following any of my work on Four Arrows, colleague that I met quite back in 2007 or so, we've written a few books together. I've written a book on him. He takes an Indigenous perspective. Indigenous Studies. Okay, so the idea of this map was really just to give you all a sense. That's how I come to fear studies, and I'm just going to put this area in here as the basic domain of fear studies. And I'm very interested in Indigenous studies, obviously, Black studies, feminist studies, and what I've called another domain that intersects with all of these. And this is really what I mostly promote and am most well known for, is fearlessness studies. And yet I mostly don't use that term fearlessness studies because it's not only is it a long word and it's hard and awkward and people sort of go, what? They don't get it, and they can't even take in the whole fearlessness phrase. They go, what would you just say? But if I say fear studies, oh, they actually get it. They never ask the question, what did you just say? So I've decided not to use fearlessness studies, even though fearlessness is one of my major perspectives of studying fearlessness from as a whole and domain. But obviously you don't study fearlessness without studying fear. So for simple sake, that's why I'm doing this diagram. It's all about fear studies, okay? So really that's the emphasis here again. And that's just what I'm going to kind of call this middle domain of knowing and knowledge, and why is that so important? This video is not going to be on all what is fear studies, etc., etc. I have so many videos on fear, fearology, fear studies, fearism. You can look at those on my video channel. What I want to bring in today is some thinking I've been doing about particularly Black studies. And I will spend a little bit of time in some detail on that. And if you're thinking of, okay, well, who is Michael, this white guy, been reading to inform himself about Black studies? Yeah, well, thanks for asking. I really like Professor Tommy Curry's work, Lewis Gordon's work. And then these are all, again, Black professors. There's probably many women that I don't know, and or trans professors I don't know from Black studies, Africana study it's sometimes called. And then just to let you know some of the people I've read in background from the Black Africana kind of context would be Biko, Frantz Fanon. I've probably spent the most time looking at his work on oppression and internalized and external oppression from a Black perspective and the challenge of colonialism. So, you know, there's many others. Obviously, Bell Hooke is Hooks is the most famous, the late Bell Hooks now. And there are some others I won't go into as well. But these folks are basically known for, and others, are known as part of this Black Studies camp, African American Studies, sometimes it's called, and then I like Africana Studies. My friend Jason Macy, certain Jason Martez Macy, Massey has really informed me over the last 10 years. He's now studying theology, Black theology, and very interesting friend and colleague, a young person who has informed me as a white person from the inside in a very enjoyable relationship, and always contested we don't agree on everything, but he basically, the term that we're all using more or less in this column is decolonization. So you may have heard of that term, what is decolonization? How is that, coming across as such an important critique of society? And remember, let's be honest about what's happening. Is it's all a critique of, whiteness and colonization. I mean whiteness in the terms of when white does not just become a skin color, but becomes an ideology, a supremacy ideology of white is great, white is civilized, Black is not, they are primitives, and so on, and we need to conquer them so that we can all be civilized on this planet, and so on. Well, there's a lot of problems with that, and now I'm going to bring it, let's bring that right down to fear studies problem. So when I went into this fear studies area, this whole thing in this interior, and then I started thinking about things that I wasn't happy with totally, in terms of why is fear studies so white? Why is it so European centric and Enlightenment centric philosophically, and etc.? And so I took fear here as a really big, wide concept. Again, not looking at fear just as a feeling and emotion. I said, I'm interested in fear studies. What has happened if we study the study of fear? So if we study the study of fear, how accurate, how good is our study of fear? I asked. When I say our, I meant humanity's study of fear. Yeah, from the beginning of time. Yeah, the big picture. Why limit it? So in that sense, this is sort of a talk on the history of fear studies and the history of why fear gets conceptualized and understood in certain ways. So I brought up this map to show that there's not just the white way of knowing fear studies. And yeah, this really has been so dominant in impacting fear studies. Okay, that's my point. It's dominated the way of thinking. Okay, so then what happened when fear studies, Black studies, or Black consciousness studies, African American studies, Africana studies, all these Black perspectives, let's call them, and I mean Black in a good sense, the capital B conscious awareness sense, not Black as it's constructed from a white lens. And that's exactly what we're trying to get around. And Lewis Gordon is really good on this discussion and his analysis that when we use a capital B is very different than using a small b on Black. And he basically says that small b on Black, when we use it, and we're referring to that Black person's perspective or just a Black perspective when we're thinking of race and thinking of color, of peoples, of difference. He says, the small b, we should keep that for people who that is really determined by a white perspective. But when you move to a capital Black perspective, and that's what I'm interested in, Black studies, these people here would all be of what I'd call Black studies. They're looking at Black from a Black perspective, even though you have to understand, in the critique, you have to understand this white colonizing perspective of Black. These folks are saying, no, no, we're not just going to look at, your version of Black. We will tell our own story of our Blackness. Okay, so this is not a talk about race and Blackness and versus whiteness, etc. This talk today is actually going to be about fear and love. And I'm going to use the analogy of what I've created here in this diagram, in the next diagram, to show kind of what I mean. But just to overview, when I come to fear studies, I realized I've got to be careful. I'm a white person myself. I'm a colonizer, part of that colonizer heritage. I've got all the thinking tools of analysis of that heritage, going back to primarily the Enlightenment era, 1700s, and the period called modernity. I'm a modern human being, and I think like a modern. And sure, I might be somewhat postmodern. I might even be postmodern, which I think I am in some ways. But fundamentally, I'm still coming from this tradition, the Eurocentric modern way of thinking. And so my argument is that when anybody goes out and says, well, I'm interested in, studying fear more, and I go, oh, great. Like, that's what I promote. So let's do it together. Let's talk about it. Let's think about it. Whatever the case, people that go out to study fear, they will go out being already impacted. And again, the person wanting to study fear may be from a very diverse background, not white at all. They may be coming from people of colors and so on. So that imposition of this white consciousness, if you want to call it, or even white unconsciousness that is so prevalent, is dominating fear studies. And it's dominating the way we define, conceptualize, articulate, theorize, philosophize about fear, theologize about fear, etc. That's what I'm going to show in the next diagram, how that's related to love, and how that domination has to be challenged, as far as I'm concerned, if you have a critical fear studies today. Now, why do I care about having a critical fear studies that is not dominated by this white perspective, let's call it modernist, Eurocentric? Why that's so important is because I think, most of us today, what we're hearing a lot about, and I certainly am, is what's being called the culture wars. Sound familiar? Yeah. Culture wars is a big deal right now. Yeah, it's causing so much conflict, divisiveness. A lot of people have been talking about it. And it's in the news everywhere as well, right? It's like it's cracking the fabric of our very social structure. There's a lot of disintegration and camps being formed, right? Ideologies, right, left, extremes, but not just that. It's like over abortion rights and over, whatever kind of, color you are and race and so on, gender, class. Great division, right? This culture wars is the big fight that's going on within culture itself. Now, this is in a lot of nations, but I can only speak mostly to North America, where I live, and that's what I'll stick with. I understand that really well, and especially observing in the United States. And most of these two top theorists up here in Black studies are Americans as well. So they're very steeped in what's happening in American culture. I'm being informed by them as well as my friend Jason, who is born and raised in the United States. Okay, so decolonizing agenda that Black studies was coming with, and Indigenous peoples have been doing the same kind of decolonizing interest. And again, this talk will not be on Indigenous, but they're very related. The decolonizing was basically saying we have to decolonize this white privilege, this white, already imposition that everything is supposed to move toward white. So in other words, fear management, their fear study and analysis and our management should be feeding back to improving and moving everybody to the way white people think about the world and reality and fear and how they operate. It's not funny. And in that sense, I jokingly laugh that the white world wants everybody to be like it. That's the fundamental principle of narcissism. So as a psychological condition, is because you think this way, you think everybody else should. And if they're not, there's something wrong with them. In other words, they're lesser. And so it's not surprising when you look at the history of certainly a white dominated society like North American, European tradition, you see that they have the white who have ruled the law and the making of so-called white civilization really have not taken in for the longest time that there are actually other beings worthy of white. And so you cannot leave out that this is a very masculinist patriarchal tradition as well. And that's why I've also studied feminist thinking, women's studies thinking, and studies bringing that to fear studies. Won't be talking about that in this. So if we just go to this analogy that decolonizing is so important in Black studies, I'm basically saying there should and ought to be a Black fear studies. Nobody has said that yet and coined it that I know of. That doesn't mean I'm great and wonderful because I'm doing that. It means that I encourage right now anyone to think about a Black fear studies. What would it look like? Now, if you've looked at or heard some of my earlier talks, I've been bringing up someone called Samuel Gillian Jr. And I call him an intellectual, organic intellectual public philosopher. And he was an educator, and he's a Black African-American man from the Bronx in New York. And he wrote 2 marvelous books on fear, which are very challenging to our normal understandings of fear. I had a little conversation with him, but so that's another story. So I am on to this Black studies picture, both my study of Gillian right now for a book I'm preparing, but also moving into this larger sphere of critique of what is capital Black studies, contribution to fear studies, what is contribution of fear studies to Black studies. So these move in complementary directions. You see across there, same with Indigenous. How can they complement each other? Same with feminist. Complement each other. All is part of a decolonizing of this dominating privileged position or default. And so let's go to the next diagram. I think I can erase this nice and quickly. So-called nice and quickly. So you got to go kind of slow with this brushing tool. Oh, that's fun to watch, isn't it? The fragmentation of knowledge here on the screen. Okay. So this I'm going to just call a couple diagrams I'll play with under the love versus fear theme. If any of you know my work, you'll know that's been a long topic. Why is love and fear come together? Well, just the simple rational backing or empirical backing is when I studied fear since 1989 as a full-time kind of study, full-time, I mean part-time, but a pretty full-time focus for my mission to understand the relationship of fear in human beings, particularly, but also the larger world of nature and beyond, that I was very interested to notice that this theme comes up in a lot of literatures, particularly of theologies, particularly religions, but also cultural views, that there seems to be this great force, something called love, something called fear, and they seem to be opposites is the way they're written about in these literatures. So that ultimately these teachings, these wisdom teachings, were saying it's better to be in love and not in fear. And in fact, some saying that we can't be both in love as a motivational principle and operation and be in a psychology of fear at the same time. Now, some people have argued, well, that's maybe not so true. It's not so clear cut. Without going into that, ontological discussion, I want to just basically say my research showed that I can't do fear studies without engaging this concept of love. And I'm not promoting love studies, you might know. And this is really basically important to this diagram. So in this sphere of motivations, there's a dark side, and a light side to this particularly lopsided drawing, which is fine because in a way I want it to be. This side is love, and this side is fear. And I wrote love in capital letters because you might notice that this is supposed to be a whole of reality. It's a symbol. And the one side is, a dark side. I'll use the shadow here to emphasize that a little more. This is the shadow side of life. The other side is the sunny side of life. So you also have light and dark, right? And if you're thinking ahead and seeing what I'm getting at, this is based on the Tao symbol, also known as yin, yang. And yin is the dark side, and yang is the light side. That's what I'm presenting, but you can see what I've done is I've transposed these concepts of love and fear, these great, not just concepts, but they're really large meta motivations onto both sides. I think this is an interesting way to look at fear studies. That's why I'm proposing this diagram. It's part of an imaginary, a new imaginary, a fresh imaginary, I think, that will stir up some interesting things in our thinking, especially trying to reinvigorate and create this new scholarship, this new fear studies that I'm speaking to. And again, I'll get back to why this is important in terms of Black studies and in the white perspective that I showed in the last diagram. My drawing tool again. So let's begin slowly on one of the problems that anyone faces coming into fear studies, attempting to have, right, this, let's just call it a Black studies perspective, is that we have to face something that is dominating already. It's dominating the sphere of reality and making love the much brighter, right, the light, the white, and it's making this the minor size. And I tried to draw them. This could even be smaller if I wanted to show it in another extreme, because in many ways it is often very small compared to love. And so maybe I'll just push that back. Whoops. So much for the precision of that drawing. Let's get back to complete that circle. And so the love side really can dominate the fear side, is what I found, in terms of what's good. And so that fear side, is shaded over here in this part of the yin yang symbol, but it's much smaller. And that's a problem. Well, it's a problem that why is love dominating so much? Okay, so fear studies, right? I'm not promoting love studies. I'm promoting fear studies, but I have to ask this question, why is this love already dominating? So if I come in as a Black scholar and I want to do Black studies, I come in and I got to start, well, how do we do Black studies when white is punching so much, white studies is punching so much of the territory? It's punching it out. And it leaves, if you're lucky, this little, bit of a category or space in the sphere of knowledge over here. And it's not much. It's reduced. So how then do you do a good fear studies under that condition? Well, that's a good question. And I'm very interested in that question. How do you do that? And the first is you got to realize that's what you're dealing with. What I mean, you got to realize critically that fear studies is already under a disappearance. Right? It's being disappeared by the expansion, the supremacy, the dominance, the hegemony of this white perspective. So maybe I should just kind of give you the analogy that in this sense, white and love have been put together. And there's a long history of how those two concepts and words and metaphors, symbols, and that's what the yin yang symbol was trying to erase, because the yin yang symbol, just to remind you, it was 50-50. If you look at any Tao symbol right on your emails, on your Google search right now, if some of you know it, some of you don't know it, black and white are the two parts of the symbol. And that's not a problem. It's a perfect balance. That's the harmony. That's the ideal. And then they often have a little black sphere on the other side, and then the white sphere on this side, which even shows, yeah, and white and black go together. You do not have one dominating the other. That's the whole idea of yin yang, balance the dominant light. This is the idea of harmony and peace and all that good stuff. Well, when you put love and fear together and use that diagram, this is what I'm showing. Why isn't fear, halfway, so that we can do fear studies? And yes, if you want, you can go do love studies, and we should be looking at both of them together. But because that's not the case, arguably, and my argument is theologically, philosophically, culturally, in the language, people find love way more positive, and that's why they promote it rather than fear. Now, some people would say, yeah, but fear is actually dominating, and there's more fear on the planet than there is love in actuality. And I go, yeah, there probably is. That's an arguable case. But in terms of fear studies is what I'm talking about today. I'm not talking necessarily about the phenomenology of how the emotion or the meta motivation of love perhaps is being dominated by fear, especially in the culture wars, which is one of the reasons, remember, that I'm doing this video today. We have to try to understand and solve this culture wars that could potentially blow us all up. So fear studies, as I said, is already under the pressure of this disappearance. There is not an even playing field. And it's been very interesting that basically we have this language that, I don't know if you've seen this language, but it's a really important one. I'll quote it because it's been said this way. Love is letting go of fear. Love is the dominant. It's the way things should be, supposedly, in this discourse. This comes from the Course in Miracles. Gerald Jampolsky, back in the 1979, wrote a book called Love is Letting Go of Fear. Marianne Williamson promotes this particular theology, discourse, etc. Many, many do. It's a long tradition. And basically, it's a tradition that says, love is more important. Fear is just the sub, and they don't put it with a capital. They like to put love with a capital. And fear is just a subcategory of that. And so the default is, again, like in Black studies and fear studies, I'm saying they're kind of the same. They have the same problem of starting to make this studies as a counter move, right? To try to push the fear studies back into the sphere of their due half, at least. Give them some space. And that's what I promote. And that's what I'm asking you as viewers to consider and think about, and consider helping this movement of fear studies move into the world. I've also called it the work of fearlessness. All of this work of expanding fear studies takes a fearlessness to be able to even do that, to push it back out. Why? Because the moment you start wanting to emphasize a program and teach people about fear, it's like people say, oh no, let's teach them about love. Don't worry about fear. Once you have enough love, right? Capital, that's the default. Once you have enough of this, well, and everybody's, gonna be conforming to it, then the world will be great. It'll be a world of love. Whiteness. See the analogy I'm playing with? And over here, all this dark stuff, that's too negative, right? Like we're trying to move the negative to positive, so we'll all be positive. And again, harmony and peace and all that stuff. All the good stuff that you can write about motherhood and apple pie. Well, no, fear studies doesn't work and think that way. We think under this criticalist perspective, just like Black studies, capital B, thinks under this criticalist perspective. And we start there. We start there understanding that problem of oppression of fear itself. And one of the simple ways of argument to understand that problem is, you may have heard this, is, we have a problem of fear itself. Won't go into that, but that's another expression of, that's kind of why this diagram ends up like this, is we're trying so hard to get to love, but we actually fear itself, rather than seeing them working in this yin-yang complementarity symbol. This would be a good symbol for fear studies, that it has this complementary, that's what we want to achieve. But you can see the culture wars is kind of love against fear against love. It's like, who's going to get to win the battle of domination of space, territory? Yeah, power, domination. Love is letting go of fear is a very dominating phrase if you look into it more carefully, politically, ideologically, not just in a spiritual context. I'm not saying there's some truth to what's behind love is letting go of fear, but there's as much truth in the utterance of fear. We're dominated by fear itself. This, you might remember, fear itself was the famous 1933 FDR Roosevelt's claim. That's all we have to fear is fear itself. Americans, come on, let's get out of this depression and win the Second World War, and the New Deal, and so on. Okay, that's politics. Not what I'm on to today, other than you can see there is a politics of knowledge. There's a politics of whose study gets to be the reference point of where we should be, where we should go. And my concern has always been is if we follow this domination of white love, in that analogy I'm using, then dark fear is going to be disappearing, becoming more thin of a shadow. And when you have a shadow, as Carl Jung and many other depth psychologists have said, that shadow being repressed will eventually blow up, because that's like in fear, enslaving fear. And I just quote Lewis Gordon, who wrote The Enslaved, speaking of Black people, Lewis Gordon speaking from a Black perspective as an academic scholar today. The enslaved were not permitted to read, write, or think for fear that they would rise up and overthrow their so-called masters. Fear was such a deep part of the small Black consciousness, and the recognition of it in Lewis Gordon, and he's written a book called Fear of Black Consciousness, capital B. He's now just today's, again, arising this long-term discussion within Black scholarship and within Black resistance movements, is when are we going to get beyond, fear controlling the relationship of these races? And I'm saying, put that now in a bigger context beyond race of culture wars. When are we going to get beyond fear dominating culture wars? And the problem is because we still operate on this really dubious notion that if we can all move in this direction, things will just be fine. So what's your problem, people over here? So I've been playing with this sort of fun part of my story as I wrap up here is we have a culture wars, is my suggestion, between love people, and I'm using people in a really large sense of that. So try not to take that too literally, but there is a certain literary quality and literal quality to it, and fear people. And they are battling on this planet on many dimensions. I can't go into, and I haven't analyzed it carefully enough, thoughtfully enough, to go into it today. Today, I'm just presenting some sketches, as you can see, of some thoughts to stir you up, to stir me up. And so I'm kind of sort of saying that, yeah, there's this problem of fear people and love people in this battle, and who's going to get, the status, the power to dominate and rule. Yeah, very real issue. I've been in this camp. I'm a fear people in that sense. Not against the love people. I'm just saying, what about even territory where we belong? At least let's start there. Maybe even strategically, I'm sort of saying we might need to even push the fear side of research, fear studies, over to more than half, just to recompensate for all these years, if not hundreds of years, of the love people dominating. And the love people would basically, promote ideologically that you can just kind of put it into the idea of, let's say, the love people, you go into the love people's house or their church or their government or whatever. And the rhetoric, the worldview would be basically to teach and promote to their children that it is, quote, better to love people than fear people. So notice positive, better than to fear people. So that is what I'm suggesting, is this whole white love territory of domination. It's shining this huge light across this diagram from left to right, pushing the shadow, trying to erase the shadow, disappear the shadowed other, the other. And it's based on what looks like love. And I'm saying it's probably fear of fear itself. That's probably what's underneath motivating that kind of love in the love people. I'm not saying all love people are dominated by that fear of fear itself, but I'm going to say the majority are, the vast majority. Without going into all that argument in detail, just trying to get this diagram in our brains to rethink, what is the culture wars today? How is it perpetuating itself? Remind ourselves, it's part of the whole topic today, that this tension, this conflict going across this vector of what motivates. Now, what are the fear people saying? So if the love people are saying it's better to fear, they're teaching their children it's better to love people than to fear people. And then you've got on the other side, folks, on fear people side, where you'd think they're saying it's better to fear people than to love people. And they see that as very positive if you're a fear in the fear people camp. Okay. But here's the big but. That is not where I'm coming from in fear studies. I do not originate along that vector. I do not set up that false dichotomy that there are just simply people promoting love, these people promoting fear, which could be fear mongering, right? Like it could be, it's better to fear people and it's better to use fear over people. These people say it's better to love people and use love over people to build a better world. Yeah, those are hard to reconcile. Those are very different. As I said, they represent part of this huge mega problem in philosophy, theology, and thought itself, and human experience. how do we come to deal with that? Yeah, it does breed a kind of culture war, right? Based on those two different arcs of trajectories of how it is the best way to be, to educate, to socialize. Well, as again, I'm not falling into this category saying it's better to fear people and use fear to move people and move society. No, I'm not saying that necessarily. What I'm saying is I want to move fear study, the study of fear, fear studies out and expand it into its due range that should be equal to this 50%. At least, and as I said, even maybe more, just to recompensate for the long domination of this white love consciousness program. And this is a program, it's a trajectory that is basically, if you're not following this, you're doing it wrong. Yeah, well, that's a problem. Like, that's why fear studies is not supported. That's why the fear discussions are not supported very much compared to, try and put a proposal together on bringing love into education. Yeah, and then try and bring a proposal to bring fear into education. So I say that very clearly because Jillian, who I mentioned earlier, this Black African American fear writer from in the years 2002, his first book, 2005, his second book, that's what he does. He's saying, he's he's a loving grandfather, beautiful man. He's got wonderful, as I've done biography work on his background, he was seen as such a gentle, caring person and helped people. I could go on and on about his background. Well, he's not saying that we should do love education. He's saying we should do fear education. So simply part of and fear studies with that fear education. Get it? Just like sex education, moral education, health education. Why is there not fear education? And I've been saying the same thing since 1989. And so it's so nice to meet independently Jillian saying the same thing. And there are, Desh Suba to be another who has said this, and a few others who have kind of come along in this, and we're fear people. But as I said, we're fear people from this camp of this positive, really productive, constructive, yet deconstructing at the same time and critical of the love people and their agenda, just like Black people consciousness, capital B, are critical of white, capital W, love project, that everybody should be moving in that direction because that's the right way. It's the default. Anybody else is just kind of less and minor and is easily to be let go of, right? Erased. That love is letting go of fear. It's like, okay, we can just drop off those people. So one quick story as I end this, I gave a talk in the early 80s. I was invited to give a talk. I was director of the In Search of Fearlessness Center. This is actually early 90s. And it was with the Emissaries for Divine Light. And I knew somebody and they said, I can get you to give a talk and give it to their community. And I thought, oh, this will be interesting because they're what I would call very new age and they follow this philosophy, love is letting go of fear. And they have a very interesting story because after I gave my talk on why fear and fearlessness is so important, they weren't totally impressed, but they listened. And then their leader comes in and says, well, this is how we look at it. You have a bowl and you fill it full of Coke halfway. And Coke is this kind of pollutant, sugar, addictive substance. It's the dark, it's not so good, right? And then they says, well, our approach to spiritual truth and cleansing is you just pour clean water into that bowl. Again, this is a metaphor, right, for our psyche, for our soul, for our being. And you just keep pouring your water in over and over and over and over and over and over. And eventually, the bowl overflows, the Coke flows out, the pure water keeps coming in. the code can't keep up, and now you have the pure white love, God, spirit, being present. It wins. Why? Because you've just poured in one side, right? You poured in the white, the love. So you can see that esoteric teaching, the love is letting go of fear, has a long trajectory, long history, and it's very dominant in a white community. And those people were all white. I can guarantee you, the emissaries of divine light that I was meeting with them back in the 90s. And so I basically disagreed on a kind of principle and argument that I gave, like this: is that, if we don't give equal privilege to our understanding and knowledge and criticality in our thinking, it's not just going to be all solved by the heart and purity. Yes, that's important. The love people really promote that. The meditative, contemplative people really promote that in education and otherwise. And I'm going, yeah, but if you think you can run all the white and all the positive only and not the negative, they are needed together. That's the whole idea of the yin yang, right? Dark light, needed both for balance. And the problem is they're not in balance. And fear studies will only recover when I believe, and I'm not sure it'll ever recover fully to get to halfway, but that's my mission, folks. That's what I'm trying to do. So let's just end the whiteboard. I think you get a sense of that. Ask any questions on that. Again, this is just a really rough sketch. I'm just playing with ideas. Really glad I could share them with you today. Let's keep in conversation on promoting fear studies in a really good way, in this new way, and learn from Black studies perspective, the Indigenous perspective, the feminist perspective. There may be other perspectives I've mentioned today, and then the fearlessness perspective, which I add. So you can see we've got some really interesting perspectives to bring to fear studies today to make this much more integral education and scholarship, new scholarship on fear. So I don't assume that I already know the best thinking and the only thinking on fear. I do not just take this white dominating perspective on fear and the way that it should be the way to go and move through, love as the primary force and dominating trajectory. All right. See you next time. Bye bye.